Habitation on the moon would allow us to visit other people with their habitation. We can keep track if there's something very important to be developed from the moon. During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union's ambitious space program captivated the world. While public missions showcased their technological prowess, whispers of secretive lunar projects have lingered for decades. Now, NASA has revealed a shocking discovery: evidence of a hidden Soviet base on the moon, concealed from the world for nearly 70 years. The Soviets knew that the Americans were overflying their territory at high altitudes. Why was it built, and what were they hiding? At the dawn of the space race, after World War II ended and the uneasy peace of the late 1940s and 1950s set in, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves in an ideological standoff known as the Cold War. Each side wanted to prove the superiority of its political and economic system, and scientific achievements became a central way of demonstrating that strength. This competition fostered an environment where space exploration emerged as a key battleground, giving rise to what we now call the space race. It was no longer enough to develop advanced missiles or gain intelligence through spy planes and satellites. Both superpowers realized they could capture international prestige by pushing beyond Earth as boundaries and showing the world how skilled they were in rocket science. The Soviet Union recognized opportunities in this field well before many Western countries, thanks to a cadre of engineers and scientists who had studied rocketry. The Soviets found themselves positioned to launch the world's first artificial satellite in 1957. When that satellite, Sputnik 1, surprised people across the globe with its beeping signal, it was a wake-up call for the United States and a propaganda triumph for the USSR. This new rivalry was about more than generating headlines. It was about claiming technological superiority and potentially ensuring military advantage. Rockets that could send satellites into orbit could also be used to deliver warheads across continents, so proving mastery in rocket propulsion became strategically significant. Under these circumstances, the Soviets built a robust space program that would deliver a series of history-making accomplishments. They saw the moon as an ultimate prize that could cement their place as the world's leading scientific power. Their vision for lunar travel and possible colonization fit neatly into the larger Cold War narrative. The Soviets would not only show that they could keep up with or surpass the United States in space technology, but they would also potentially gain a foothold in a completely new off-world environment. That possibility electrified their imagination. At the same time, it spurred policymakers to channel sizable resources, labor, and brainpower into missions that had never before been attempted in human history. In those early years, the Soviet Union seemed practically unstoppable. They accomplished extraordinary feats in quick succession and awakened the public to the promise of space exploration. Each launch and breakthrough was seen as another indicator that the USSR might dominate space. However, while the world applauded these successes, few realized that the Soviet program also struggled with internal politics, secrecy, and rival organizations. These hurdles added layers of complexity that would come to the forefront as they moved closer to their most ambitious goal: putting a person on the moon before the Americans could. The pace of Soviet achievements in the late 1950s and early 1960s made it appear as if they were running rings around the United States. By October 1957, they had orbited Sputnik 1, the world's first satellite, creating widespread amazement. Less than 2 years later, Luna 2 became the first human-made object to impact the moon. It didn't land gently, but it proved the Soviets had the precision to guide a spacecraft to our nearest celestial neighbor. These events not only sparked scientific curiosity, but also generated powerful propaganda, with the USSR proclaiming itself the most advanced nation in spaceflight. Next came the monumental achievement of putting the first human being in space. When the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth in April 1961, he became an immediate global icon and a hero to the Soviet people. His Vostok 1 flight demonstrated that the USSR had the capability to send a person into orbit and bring him home safely, a notion that felt like fantasy just a few years prior. Then, in 1965, Alexei Leonov became the first human to perform a spacewalk, floating outside his spacecraft as the entire planet looked on in wonder. The Soviets clearly had a flair for being first. Their successes continued with Luna 9 in 1966, which achieved the first soft landing on the lunar surface. It overcame the challenge of delivering a functioning spacecraft onto alien terrain without crashing on impact. 2 years later, with Zond 5, they sent a spacecraft around the Moon and safely returned it to Earth. That flight carried tortoises and other biological specimens, proving that living creatures could survive a loop around the Moon. These achievements were far from superficial stunts. Each victory taught valuable lessons in propulsion, navigation, life support, and spacecraft design, building greater confidence within the Soviet space establishment. The Soviets were well aware that the United States had set its sights on the Moon. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy had famously declared that America would land a man on the Moon and return him safely before the end of the decade. The Soviets had their own lunar plans in motion, but they were under immense pressure to match Kennedy's challenge. Engineers and mission planners moved forward with an approach they believed would not just match Apollo, but demonstrate Soviet prowess in both technology and strategy. Documents from the era show that the USSR intended to send cosmonauts to the Moon in a way that was roughly parallel to Apollo, yet different in some key aspects. They planned to rely on a family of launch vehicles generically referred to as the N1L3 complex. The N1 rocket would be the backbone of the operation. Once the payload, known as the L3 Luna stack, arrived in orbit, the cosmonauts would use a specially designed LK lander to descend to the surface. The single cosmonaut who set foot on the Moon would then return to lunar orbit, rejoin the other crew in the orbiting module, and travel back to Earth. One intriguing quality of this plan was that transferring between modules would require a spacewalk. The LK lander had no internal tunnel connection to the L3 orbital compartment, so the cosmonaut would need to put on a suit and physically move through open space to reach the lander. Although this process saved weight in spacecraft design, it also added risk. Yet Soviet engineers were confident that, given their successes with earlier spacewalks, they could manage this procedure safely. The timeline of these missions was carefully calculated. There would be an initial Earth orbit phase, a translunar injection to set the spacecraft on course for the Moon, and a final braking maneuver to establish lunar orbit. The cosmonaut would then descend to the surface. The whole venture was intended to show Soviet capability in building heavy rockets, managing complex orbital maneuvers, and safely returning humans from another celestial body. By the mid-1960s, the project had a strong sense of momentum, and the Soviet public, as well as many international onlookers, fully expected their nation to keep dominating the competition. The world eagerly anticipated a Soviet success that would rival or outdo what NASA was preparing. Systems for life support, landing, and ascent were all integrated into a compact frame. The lander would touch down on the Moon, with the cosmonaut performing a short stay to gather samples, plant a Soviet flag, and take photographs. The reascent would follow the same minimalistic ethic. The upper stage of the LK would fire, jettisoning any unneeded mass, and the cosmonaut would return to orbit for a rendezvous with the L orbiter. A spacewalk would again serve as the method of transferring the cosmonaut and the lunar samples back into the orbital module. The lander would then be discarded, and the L3's engine would power the journey home. The cosmonauts would complete re-entry in a small return capsule, touching down in Soviet territory. This procedure was riskier than Apollo's design because of the extent of extravehicular activity required. Yet Soviet engineers believed it was feasible, given their successful spacewalk experiences. They reasoned that this approach saved critical weight by avoiding the need for an internal tunnel. Nonetheless, the entire mission hinged on the reliability of every stage and engine firing without fail. Even a minor error could lead to mission failure. Planners felt confident because of the experience they had gained from robotic lunar probes and the Zond program. However, those were uncrewed missions that could absorb a greater margin of error. For a crewed mission, precision was paramount, and the repeated issues with the N1 rocket soon cast a shadow over the entire enterprise. Bold plans for a Soviet moon base. While the first goal was to land a cosmonaut on the Moon, the Soviet vision did not stop there. They drafted serious concepts for a permanent lunar presence, often referred to as the Zvezda base. By building a series of inflatable or expandable modules delivered by multiple N1 launches, the Soviets hoped to establish a self-sustaining habitat. Each module would be buried under regolith for shielding against radiation, temperature extremes, and micrometeorites. Detailed sketches showed inflatable corridors, living spaces, laboratories, medical stations, exercise areas, and even a galley for communal dining. Designers believed that a small nuclear reactor could power the base, providing electricity for lighting, heating, and scientific instruments. Resources such as oxygen could be produced from lunar soil, and certain metals might be extracted to help maintain or expand the station structures. Engineers working on these concepts studied closed-loop systems that recycled air and water, imagining how cosmonauts could live on the moon for extended periods without continual resupply from Earth. One of the more unusual facets of the plan involved creating a Luna train, a chain of rover-like vehicles capable of carrying people, equipment, and drilling rigs across the moon's surface. Each car would have independent electric motors, robust suspension, and protective shielding. This train would allow crews to explore, mine resources, and transport materials back to the base. It was a futuristic concept, especially in an era when only a handful of spacecraft had ever made soft landings. There was also careful thought given to the psychological well-being of crews. Long-term separation from Earth could cause stress and loneliness, so engineers considered placing false windows in the habitat with changing scenes to mimic terrestrial sunrises or seasonal landscapes. They knew exercise would be essential, and even proposed a film projector that could simulate bicycle rides through countryside roads. It all seemed visionary and reflective of a broader Soviet desire to show not just that they could arrive on the moon, but that they could thrive there. Even after multiple failures with the N-1 rocket, the dream of Zvezda lingered, hinting at a future in which the Soviets might have turned lunar colonization into a reality far earlier than most people would have imagined. Internal chaos and the loss of Korolev's death in 1966 created a void in leadership that none of his successors could effectively fill. He had held the disparate parts of the Soviet space program together, balancing engineering rigor with political demands. After he was gone, various design bureaus continued the N-1 project, but coordination was lacking. Vasily Mishin took over the program, but he did not command the same respect or authority, and he struggled to maintain discipline on such a complicated endeavor. Meanwhile, Valentin Glushko's influence rose within the Soviet hierarchy, thanks to his direct connections to the government. He pushed for engine designs that Korolev had opposed, and resources kept shifting among different rocket concepts. The entire program was also dealing with the reality that NASA was making steady progress with Apollo. The Saturn V, tested thoroughly in separate stages, did not suffer the same cluster-based complexities or the same secrecy constraints. NASA's methodical approach to public testing and problem-solving allowed them to identify flaws early. Meanwhile, the Soviets often discovered major problems only during live launches, when the margin for error was minimal. Funding priorities also changed as the lunar race dragged on. Hopes of beating the United States were slipping. Some in the Soviet military began to argue that resources might be better allocated to building space stations or more advanced ballistic missiles. The secrecy that had once protected the mystique of the Soviet program now became a disadvantage, preventing knowledge sharing that could have improved rocket reliability. Even though the Soviet public continued to hear bold statements about space exploration, the reality was that many in the higher echelons doubted the N-1 could be fixed in time to claim any real victory over Apollo. A further complication was that NASA's Apollo 11 mission succeeded in July 1969. The image of Neil Armstrong stepping onto the lunar surface was broadcast worldwide. This event overshadowed any Soviet achievement that might have come later. The Soviet Union did not officially acknowledge that its own parallel program had been aiming for the same goal. Instead, government officials stressed their success in robotic exploration, hoping to salvage some measure of pride. Nonetheless, engineers pressed forward, determined to prove that the N-1 rocket was not a lost cause, and that a Soviet cosmonaut might still reach the moon. But with every test failure, that optimism dimmed. The ill-fated launch attempts of the N-1 between 1969 and 1972. The Soviet Union attempted to launch the N-1 rocket 4 times. Each flight ended in dramatic failure, and the details of these mishaps remained classified for many years. The first launch in February 1969 saw the rocket rise briefly before engines began shutting down prematurely, leading to a destructive crash. Although it was a setback, some hoped that analysis of debris and telemetry would strengthen the next attempt. The second launch in July 1969 was far more catastrophic. It occurred just 2 weeks before the American Apollo 11 flight. In a move that many later regarded as rushed, the Soviets attempted to impress the world by sending an uncrewed spacecraft toward the moon. Almost immediately after liftoff, an engine turbopump malfunctioned and power levels collapsed. The N-1 lost thrust, tipped over, and exploded in an enormous fireball as it fell back onto the launch pad. The resulting blast was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. It leveled the launch complex, scattered debris across a wide area, and set the program back by many months. The third launch in June 1971 showed no improvement. The rocket destabilized during flight and broke apart, leaving a massive crater where it came down. In November 1972, the fourth attempt seemed more promising at first, with the rocket climbing for over a minute. But once again, high vibrations and fuel line failures led to an explosive end. Pieces of the booster rained down, and any hope for a swift fix was crushed. Each of these events undermined the dream of a crewed mission that would rival Apollo. Meanwhile, NASA successfully sent multiple Apollo missions to the Moon between 1969 and 1972, conducting increasingly sophisticated scientific research.